From the diminishing of Belgian domestic relations to the toxic environmental hazards in China, today we look at countries that might not survive the next 30 years. Number 9. North Korea. Though they continue to claim successful self-reliance, experts believe the resources of North Korea will be depleted over the course of the next 2 decades. But fluctuating tensions between North and South Korea, as well as between North Korea and the United States over the past 2 years, have teased hints of their entering the modern world and leaving their self-imposed isolation. Talks between the Koreas began earlier this year, with North Korean leader Kim Jong Un making many agreements to strengthen relations with their southern neighbors. Among them is their recent pledge to denuclearize, but many believe these statements to simply be progressive on the surface, with North Korea adding the requirement of a vague contingency regarding partial denuclearization of the United States. Thus, the future of the Koreas, while somewhat hopeful publicly, remains to be seen. Number 8. Belgium. Though united by borders, the people of Belgium are inherently split between the northern region of Flanders and the southern region known as Wallonia. Mostly inhabited by French-speaking peoples, the residents of Wallonia differ greatly from the Flemish people of Flanders. At the center of the two is a region characterized by the country's capital, Brussels, and serves as a multicultural center of the nation. It was established through the Belgian government in the 1980s following mass divisions over linguistic and class differences that the Dutch-speaking community, the French-speaking community, and region-specific bodies would all have individual governments within Belgium. As time went on, the responsibilities and jurisdiction of these individual governments grew, and the regions of the nation continued to drift further apart. And with that distance grew the differences between Wallonia and Flanders as cultural and political hostility became a focal point of debate rather than linguistics. Some experts say it's only a matter of time until the two regions seek total independence from each other. Number 7. Ukraine. A developing nation, Ukraine split from the Soviet Union to become an independent country in 1991. The nation would go on to declare itself a neutral country, but still formed a military partnership with nations of the Russian Commonwealth, and later with NATO as well. Constantly torn between allying with and separating from their Cossack cousins, tensions came to a head in 2013 after Ukrainian President Viktor Yanukovych suspended negotiations with the European Union in favor of developing closer ties with Russia. As a result of this decision, protests broke out in November of that year with calls for Yanukovych's resignation gaining in popularity. By January of 2014, the president had signed anti-protest laws, evoking a violent response from protesters. Occupations and resistance hit the city of Kiev, leaving 98 casualties, 100 missing persons, and 15,000 injured across a 3-day time span the following month. Within days of this incident, members of parliament voted to remove the president from office and hold an impromptu election for his replacement. A pro-European Union candidate, Petro Poroshenko, won the election, but that would not be the end of their issues. The day following Yanukovych's removal from office, the Russian government began planning to annex Crimea, effectively invading Ukraine and supposedly assisting with the secession of the Republic of Crimea. In addition, many insurgents across Ukraine claiming loyalty to Russia began to siege buildings and hold referendums to legitimize their actions. Dedicated to fending off these aggressors, talks including the United States and the EU along with Ukraine and Russia have attempted multiple times to quell the situation. But militaristic tensions persist. Battling the insurgents and Russian loyalists throughout Ukraine has led to a total count of more than 9,000 casualties. Combine that with the lowest personal income and second lowest GDP per capita in Europe, and you have the makings for a country in deep trouble. Number 6. Spain. In the past century, Spain has been through a lot. A civil conflict in the 1930s, followed by the rule of militaristic dictator Francisco Franco, put the nation in a strange spot, isolated from the rest of Europe and suspended in a state of strictly discriminatory fascism. Spain remained extremely conservative in this condition until 1975, when a new king of Spain was named and succeeded to the position of head of state. But by 1978, a new Spanish constitution was approved and the transition to democracy was underway. Many other acts of rebellion would affect the people of Spain, including incidents of pro-Franco police firing on pro-democracy civilians in the 1970s and an attempted coup d'etat in the 1980s. A Basque militant group called ETA continued long past the rule of Franco for which they were established, waging a nationalistic campaign against the state. In the 1990s, it was discovered that some Spanish politicians had allegedly created death squads in response to the Basque insurgents, and the government was again renewed amid scandal. Terrorist attacks, economic and financial crises, attempted and sequestered declarations of independence, and many other troubles have plagued the country in the 21st century, showing that even today, Spain stands on unstable ground. Heading into the next decade with an extensive history of civil unrest backing them, the future of Spain is shaky at best. Number 5. China. Plagued by the consequences of unchecked industrialization, China is one of the most polluted countries on Earth. More than half of the nation's freshwater resources are well beyond safe for human consumption. In addition to poor water standards and few clean water reserves, which experts predict to be depleted in the next decade, China also suffers from extreme air pollution. Respiratory interference due to pollution has resulted in hundreds of thousands of premature fatalities. Even with the largest military in the world, China can't continue on tainted resources forever. It may be hard to imagine China reaching the breaking point of no usable water or air, but if living standards remain that low, then a resistance to the communist regime is near inevitable. Number 4. Iraq. Long since split, the nation of Iraq has a long-standing history of oppression, violence, and division. Splintered off into the Islamic sects of the Kurds, Sunnis, and Shiites, Iraq may never return to the sum of its parts. The country's central government is stationed in the southern region as the Kurds hold the north and the Islamic State controls a large portion of western Iraq. This type of environment only makes issues like health and education more dire, as spending and safety are extremely sparse. In addition to the struggles of being a religious battlefield, Iraq faces various environmental dangers thanks to oil spills, debris from military operations being released into the environment, poor sanitation efforts, and other sources of pollution. At this rate, the various regions of the country will have to decide soon whether to reunify or split entirely if they wish to progress from their current condition. Number 3. Libya. When drawing border lines, the intended effect is to unify the peoples within that boundary. But sometimes, as we've seen with other examples on this list, you're simply giving the sub-communities within that population something to fight over. Crafted from Italian colonialism, the country of Libya has had its fair share of rebellion over the years, revolting against foreign occupation for 35 years before declaring independence in 1947. The first royalty of Libya, King Idris, would lead the country from 1951 to 1969. Mass oil reserves suddenly increased the wealth of the nation, though causing many to garner resentment towards the new upper class. In 1969, military leader Muammar Gaddafi led a coup d'etat against the king, seizing government control and turning the country into an authoritarian state. For years, political dissent was repressed and domestic surveillance was heightened throughout Libya. There would be coup attempts, but never successful, and always met with harsh punishment. Gaddafi would later establish a direct democracy government, claiming to serve mainly as a figurehead within the country. The newfound wealth of the nation, however, would end up funding firearms purchases and criminal organizations around the world. In 2011, Libya underwent a revolution in conjunction with the Arab Spring movement, a collection of protests, riots, and insurgencies that led to the uprooting of leadership in Egypt and Tunisia. Tragic acts by Gaddafi's forces in response to the rebellion led to the intervention of the United Nations and NATO with the goal of protecting the people of Libya. After months of combat, the struggle ended in October of the same year with more than 30,000 Libyan casualties. Following Gaddafi's downfall, the government of Libya has been split by the various armed militias, representing their own specific regions. Rule of law was split between two rival parliaments, who both claimed to have the right to run the country. Violent disagreements and retaliations marred the relationship between the two ruling parties until earlier this year when the rival leaders agreed to conjoin to hold parliamentary and presidential elections. Number 2. The UK. With their recent decision to leave the European Union with the Brexit movement, disagreement within the United Kingdom has begun to boil over. With the push to leave the EU coming primarily from Britain, the other nations that form the UK have expressed discontent with what feels like a forced exit from the coalition. Northern Ireland and Wales, which both have their own parliaments, have the potential to one day gain full independence. Northern Ireland especially has faced issues since Brexit began becoming a focal point of the consequences and difficulties with leaving the EU. A beacon of free trade among Western Europe, and considered a regular commute for the people of Ireland, many rely on Northern Ireland's open borders. Scotland held a vote as recently as 2014 on whether or not to leave the UK, with its voters rejecting the notion by a 55% majority. But in an even more united effort, more than two-thirds of the Scottish population voted against Brexit in 2016. The Welsh were much more split when voting on leaving the EU, however, so discontent with connection to the other countries of the UK most likely would be generated elsewhere. Only time will tell if leaving the EU will lead to the resurgence of the United Kingdom as the premier world power, or leave it splintered into individual autonomous nations. Number 1. The Maldives. A protected island nation in the Indian Ocean, the Maldives endured a torrential disaster in 2004. A massive tsunami caused by a ridiculous 9.1 magnitude undersea earthquake left $470 million in damages, equating to 62% of the nation's GDP. Composed of almost 1,200 coral islands, the Maldives had only 9 islands escape flooding, with 57 taking serious damage to infrastructure, 14 requiring total evacuation, and 6 islands being destroyed entirely. Following this disaster, the Maldives attempted to establish a democratic direct presidential election amidst a steep economic downturn. Though spirits improved socially, a stirring resentment toward Western ideologies would inspire a revolution against the president, establishing a government that would only last 6 years before another militaristic takeover would take place. The rapidity with which rule has changed and the struggle to stabilize post-tsunami keep the future of the Maldives in constant question.